The peat split open, not from a machine, from a hoof. 15 water buffalo entered a dead reed channel near Latia Forest. The channel had held no open water in over a decade. Within 72 hours, the ground beneath them began to give. I'm Dr. Raymond Finch. I spent 40 years watching ecosystems collapse by millimeter and come back by the ton. I have seen a lot of unexpected things in the field. What happened in that channel in the spring of 2022 was not like the others. Romania had already committed €2 million and 7 years of mechanical dredging to reopen that same wetland system. The machines gouged, the engineers measured, and the channels silted closed again. The buffalo did not dredge, they wallowed. Each animal weighs close to 900 kilograms. That mass, rolling and pressing into saturated peat, does something a steel bucket cannot. It carves, slowly, repeatedly, with body heat and body weight. The peat collapses inward. 3 depressions formed in those first 72 hours, each one wide enough to hold standing water. Deli Sandu, wetland ecologist and Rewilding Europe project coordinator at the Latia site, had written her baseline estimate that same week. She expected a full season before any measurable change appeared in the channel. The machines had run for 7 years, without producing 3 stable open water depressions in that stretch. The buffalo produced them before Sandu's ink was dry. Here is what that baseline report never accounted for. The buffalo were also eating. Their heavy grazing stripped the reed stems that had been choking the channel's light for 10 years. The reeds thinned. Light hit the water, and something in the channel began to move again. Something Sandu had not planned to measure until the following summer. In Act 2, we follow Sandu's field notes across 4 sites in the Danube Delta. And the numbers in those pages do not behave the way restoration economics says they should. Drive the road east toward the delta, and the view is convincing. Tall Phragmites australis stalks rise 4 meters above the floodplain. Birds work the sky. Standing pools catch the light at the margins. From behind a windshield, it looks like a living marsh. Step off the road and kneel at the edge. What you feel underfoot is not soft sediment. It is compacted vegetative mat. Phragmites' root mass packed so dense it has displaced the flowing system beneath it, centimeter by centimeter, for 3 decades. Sandu's field notes crossed 4 sites, and everyone told the same story in a different accent. In the Latia Forest corridor, open water surface had contracted by 60% across 30 years. The amphibian breeding pools that once dotted the floodplain had silted to the depth of a man's palm. Along the Danube floodplain near Pardina, 15,600 hectares had been diked and drained for Soviet-era agriculture. When the farming collapsed, the reed moved in, and no wetland returned. In the Dobrogea channel network, flow velocity had dropped to near 0. The corridors were no longer moving. They were standing rot. Near the Sfântu Gheorghe Arm, fish nursery habitat had contracted by 40% within a single generation. The men who remembered where the perch schooled now found only reed shadow. Across the delta's core biosphere reserve zone, systematic surveys had recorded open water plant species falling from 23 to 11. 12 species, gone from the living record, surviving only in pressed herbarium samples. Sandu's site notes from that first assessment did not begin with vegetation counts. They began with smell, sulfur, stagnation, the specific chemistry of anaerobic sediment, biology consuming itself because the flow that once flushed it had been sealed off. This is the part that made me stop and reread the field notes. Romania had committed €2 million and 7 years of mechanical intervention to restore flow across this system. The dredges moved sediment. They did not move the Phragmites' root architecture, pressing in behind every cleared meter. The machines cleared a cross-section. The reed filled it. Phragmites australis advances at roughly 4 meters per growing season under ideal nutrient conditions. And the stagnant, nitrogen-rich sediment the dredges disturbed was close to ideal. The intervention was, in effect, fertilizing the problem. What no engineering brief had modeled was the grazing pressure needed to hold an opening once cut. A machine clears. It does not graze. It does not return the following morning and strip the new shoots before they root. The marsh looked alive from the road because Phragmites is extremely good at looking like a wetland while replacing one. The monoculture held 560 hectares of the latest site in biological stasis, uniform, dense, and nearly silent beneath the canopy of stems. When Sandu walked the perimeter of Site 3 in early 2022, she logged 0 amphibian calls across a 400-meter transect at dusk, a corridor that historical records from the 1990s placed at over 6 breeding species. The silence was the data, and the data said the postcard view was a lie. In Act 3, Sandu's notes moved from diagnosis to something harder to explain. The 15 animals had been on site for 6 weeks, and the biological counts at 3 of her 4 monitoring plots were already trending in a direction the mechanical restoration had never achieved in 7 years of active intervention. Or 6 weeks in, and Deli Sandu's monitoring plots were already moving. Not drifting, moving. Biological activity at 3 of her 4 measurement stations had climbed past the threshold her methodology defined as ecologically meaningful. The machines had been running since 2012. Diesel engines, licensed crews, seasonal haul roads carved into the reed beds the project was built to protect. Every cut channel needed re-clearing within 18 months. Between 2012 and 2019, Romania and European funding partners committed €2 million to mechanical dredging in those target channels. 7 years of active intervention, seasonal and relentless. The rhizome did not care. Dense enough to blunt a steel blade, the reed's underground mat regrew from every fragment the bucket teeth left behind. The machines were fighting biology with geometry. Biology won every time. The 7-year measurable outcome, approximately 120 hectares of marginally functional open water surface, before the reed margins began reclaiming the edges. The buffalo, in 2 seasons, held 90 hectares with no diesel and no crew. In 2019, Sandu presented the dredging outcome data to the restoration panel. A senior hydrological engineer pushed back. He called biological reintroduction of large herbivores an uncontrolled variable in a managed hydrological system. His formal objection is still in the project record. He was not wrong that they were uncontrolled. He was wrong about what uncontrolled would produce. A single adult buffalo weighs close to 900 kilograms. When it rolls into a wallow, that weight fractures the rhizome mat beneath it, not cuts it, fractures it. And the broken plate cannot regenerate the way a clean-cut fragment can. The buffalo solved the problem the bucket never reached. The wallow itself becomes infrastructure. The hooves compact the perimeter. The body displaces water downward, and the depression holds permanent depth through dry season. A breeding pool that did not exist the season before. Sandu had not scheduled her biological activity counts at those plots until the following summer. The buffalo were 6 weeks in. Her methodology was not built for this pace, and the data coming back from 3 of those 4 stations showed biological recovery. At a rate the 7-year dredging program had never recorded at any point in its operation. The machines left rhizome, the buffalo left water. And what the water is now beginning to carry back into those channels, that is what Act 4 is about. What the channels are now carrying is a sequence, not a miracle, not a metaphor. A sequence with measurable steps, each one triggered by the one before it. An animal drops 900 kilograms onto saturated peat. The peat fractures. The shoulder rolls. Displaced mud piles at the rim and slows the outflow. Within 48 hours, that depression holds standing liquid, 30 to 60 centimeters deep, where there was solid ground the morning before. The reed cannot recolonize an actively used wallow. The animal returns. The pool persists. By the 2nd week, the open depression runs 4 degrees warmer than the surrounding channel. That thermal signature is not incidental. Aquatic invertebrates read it chemically. It is an advertisement, and the right species answer it. Within 3 weeks, Deli Sandu's team at the Litea site documented the first egg masses of the European fire-bellied toad along the wallow margins. The species had been absent from that corridor for over a decade. It did not need an invitation. It needed 30 centimeters of warm, open, undisturbed liquid, and something had just provided exactly that. The toads drew grass snakes. The open surface drew dragonflies. 6 dragonfly species established oviposition sites in the first season alone, where the dense reed monoculture had held none. Light was the next mechanism. Grazing stripped the reed along the channel edge. Sunlight reached the surface for the first time in years. Submerged vegetation began recruiting from the seed bank that same season. Seeds that had waited, dormant, for conditions that never came under the closed canopy. Where the plants returned, juvenile fish moved in from the main channel. Sandu's 2022 baseline report, filed the same week the 15 animals entered the zone, had projected none of this within the first season. Her field notes across all 4 Danube Delta sites show no prior instance of this recruitment pace, and yet the fish came anyway, on their own schedule, reading conditions her models had not anticipated. Every arrival followed the same logic. Restore the 3 physical conditions a species requires, and it locates the site on its own. Open liquid surface, thermal gradient, light penetration. Nothing more complicated than that. White storks appeared at the site by the second summer. Wading, hunting, standing in the shallows, Sandu had not included in any recovery projection she had written. Not one of her pre-intervention documents names them as a target species. They arrived because the shallow open margin fit them. That is all the reason physics requires. What Act 5 will show you is the number Sandu finally submitted to the restoration panel. The total species count across those 4 monitored stations, 18 months after the baseline she filed in 2022. It is a number that made the senior hydrological engineer go quiet in the room. That number, the one that made the hydrological engineer go quiet, was 47 documented taxa across 4 monitored stations, 18 months after Deli Sandu filed her 2022 baseline at the Ledia site. But by the time that number landed on the panel's table, the herd had already moved. Not drifted, moved. Deliberate, daily, following ground that gave beneath them 2.3 kilometers beyond the boundary drawn on the management plan. A cadastral line means nothing to an animal reading soil moisture and forage density. They reached a neighboring parcel, former agricultural margin, thin hay production, a landowner who had managed it quietly for years. The buffalo worked it the way they work every saturated margin. They broke the peat cap, 4 wallow depressions carved in, filled within weeks, and did not drain when the animals moved on. The landowner lost use of approximately 3 hectares. Sandu documented it in her Year 2 field report. She did not soften a word of it. That is the honest cost, not a footnote. A cost. A living engineer does not clock out at the end of a work order. The demographic model had predicted gradual growth. The herd disagreed. Within 3 seasons, the founder group of 15 had expanded toward 22, and 22 water buffalo moving freely across a semi-managed delta is a different political variable than 15. Local fishermen reported 2 incidents of the animals blocking access tracks to traditional fishing grounds. The Regional Water Authority issued a formal notice. Active bank undercutting at a drainage crossing the herd used repeatedly. A formal government notice. Because the animals were doing their job too well, too far, and with no regard for jurisdictional boundaries drawn by people who were not there when the delta was alive. None of it erased the 47 taxa. None of it drained the pools or silenced the fire-bellied toads. But it confirmed exactly what the Oversight Committee had minimized when Sandu first submitted her proposal. That a rewilding intervention without a fence is also a negotiation with every institution that shares the map. What Rewilding Europe is now weighing, and what the panel has not yet voted on, is whether the boundary moves to meet the animals or whether the animals get a fence. Those are not the same answer. Sandu closed her 3rd-year monitoring report with a single line, "I have read it more than once." The system responded as though it had been waiting. It had been waiting. The seed bank locked in the peat beneath those reed beds held viable aquatic plant material that had not germinated in over 30 years. It was not dead. It was held under, starved of light by a reed canopy that had been choking the channel for a decade. Sandu filed her baseline estimate in 2022, the same week the 15 water buffalo entered the dead reed channel. She had not planned to measure renewed biological activity until the following summer. The system did not wait for her schedule. 1 animal broke the peat cap. Light reached the seed bank. What followed was not restoration. It was resumption biology, picking up exactly where it had been forced to stop. Her baseline report had not accounted for the buffalo's grazing effect on reeds that had been blocking the channel's light for 10 years. That omission is not a failure. It is an honest record of what a live system can do that a model cannot predict. Romania spent €2 million over multiple dredging seasons and recovered a temporary channel. The buffalo recovered a living one, at zero mechanical cost, and seeded it with 30 years of stored biological potential the engineers never knew was there. By the end of year 3, Sandu's field notes, spanning 4 sites across the Danube Delta, recorded 47 returning taxa in the core restoration zone. That number did not come from a machine. It came from a hoof, breaking a crust that had been sealed for 3 decades. That is not a miracle. That is physics. When you return the missing tool and step aside, the system finds its own level, every time, in every ecosystem, where the underlying structure has not been destroyed beyond repair. Drop your region, and one species you have personally watched disappear from your area in your lifetime. And yes or no in the comments. Have you ever seen something come back that you were certain was gone for good? Because if the answer is yes, I want to hear that story. Share this with someone who still believes the damage is permanent, because the evidence says otherwise. Next, 4 reintroduced Eurasian beavers rebuilt 1.8 kilometers of functional wetland in under 2 seasons in the Scottish Highlands. On a river, Scotland's environmental agency had spent 14 years trying to stabilize through engineered reinforcement, with no lasting result. Scotland's environmental agency declared in 2002 that beaver activity on that river class posed an unacceptable flood risk, a position the hydrology data has since quietly contradicted without any public revision. What a beaver does to a river's flood pulse is something the models did not predict, and that gap between the model and the water is exactly where the next film begins. I'm Dr. Raymond Finch. I'll see you in the field.